Welcome back to Tuesday. Coming up on Worlds Asunder.
I mean, cosmology is central to everything that I do in these books. Like the question of not just what's true, but what people think is true, or how they misunderstand it, or how their understanding changes over time is a central aspect of all my world building. And I always want that to be core to it.
The stories we've read capture our attention and immerse our minds in settings of all kinds to bring us the spectrum of feelings and deliver the tale of tales to our starving psyches.
Whether it's medieval-style fantasy with mages and knights,
or hard sci-fi takes on the future of space colonization,
or thrillers set in your backyard, world building is the foundation that holds up the narrative, the glue that keeps it from unraveling as readers follow the journey you laid out for them, all to make the stories jump from the pages and burn themselves into our memories.
Welcome, weary writers, to Book Career in a Year's network of podcasts. This is Worlds Asunder, an insightful podcast on world and character building.
My co-host is the one and only David Shadoin, better known as Shady. It's not just a descriptor, it's also his moniker.
And she's the H.Y. Gregor, but you can call her Haley or Sour Patch, your friendly post-apocalyptic wasteland elf.
We know. We have nearly a score of published novels and short stories between us, but who the hell are we to teach you about world building and character development? We get it, which is why we decided to call in some favors.
Each week, we pull from a list of the best and brightest authors, editors, and publishers to give tips and guidance on tackling the age-old questions and provide you with tools on how to accomplish world building like the pros. From environment to magic to characters, how do we strike a balance between what matters to our audiences and what matters to keep it all straight? Open up your ear holes
and your minds
and get ready for us to tear Worlds Asunder.
So, if you're ready,
just knock and enter. Cool. All right. Welcome back to Worlds Asunder. This is the only podcast giving you world building and making you smell like smoke. And that's only because I'm drinking really peaty scotch.
There's actually a funny thing about that, because I live across the street from a Polish sausage factory. So we have days, it's very Chicago, we have days where wood smoke rolls across the house. It actually smells wonderful, but, complicated.
I was going to say, are you hungry all the time?
Oh, yeah, but not related to that. That's just a general rule.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if I'd be able to... Chicago is the land of, all the food, and I would not be able to control myself.
It is one of the problems. It's actually one of the best parts of Chicago is just the food, but we'll stop talking about Chicago now.
Oh, all good.
It's all right.
All good.
It's all right. This is par for the course as far as this podcast is concerned, as we go on tangents about all the fun things, especially because Haley doesn't ever know what I'm going to say for the intro, so it usually spawns some sort of tangent.
I'm just here for the ride. I'm hanging out.
Speaking of introducing things, I am your host, Shady, David Shadoin, both a moniker and a descriptor. And for those of you who are longtime listeners, first-time callers, that's nothing new to you. And you know that I edit a bunch of shady things into the video, and it's always funny, as far as I'm concerned. Makes me laugh. That's all that matters. My co-host, Haley H.Y. Gregor. Haley's her real name, not her moniker.
It can be both.
It could be both. But today, we have an exciting guest, all the way dialing in from Chicago. Born in rural North Carolina, the son of a theologian, and the last in a long line of telephony princes, tourist attraction barons, and gruff Scottish bankers. I love your bio. It's so much fun to read. He moved to Chicago for college, stayed to pursue his lifelong obsession with apocalyptic winters. He lives, nay, flourishes, with his brilliant, tolerant, loving wife, who is a wonderful human being, and we always enjoy getting to see her.
She seems great.
Jen's awesome. He splits his time between pewter miniatures and fountain pens. He has It looks like 6 current series, 10 novels in between them, a bunch of novellas and shorts, including the serial novellas, the Bladecaster Ephemera series. And he's got an upcoming Kickstarter, which we will definitely mention, if not in the show notes, later in the show. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest today, one of this generation's big high fantasy authors, steampunk, and genre blenders, Tim Akers.
Howdy.
Tim, welcome to Worlds Asunder.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Glad to be here. Yeah, that's the same bio I've been using pretty much my entire career. So it's accurate, you know. I mean, and it tells you the story of who I am. The whole thing about telephony barons and sideshow jokers. My grandparents on my father's side in Colorado built a Wild West museum before I was born. And my summers involved flying out there and working like the concession stands. And that's kind of like how I got. The reason I'm good at selling books is because I used to be really good at selling novelty posters. It's with like the wanted posters with your name and, you know, wrestles a gator, that kind of thing. So yeah, that sort of nonsense is just baked into my blood. And my dad's a pastor, so that's also kind of baked into my blood. The selling things.
Yeah, there you go.
So I grew up in Colorado. Where is this museum?
It's in the Springs. It's
okay.
Between Colorado Springs and Manitou.
Okay.
Yep.
We will have to look it up. We'll have to find it.
Oh, please don't. It's called Ghost Town. And if you go, they have one of the gimmicks, the novelty things there are all of these party line telephones that are sort of spread throughout. It's a boardwalk of a ghost town, theoretically. And there's all these party line telephones, and you pick it up and there's this tape that's been playing since the 1970s. That's just kind of like a conversation that's going on. And those are my grandparents that are talking. So there's a lot of Akers blood in that place. So yeah.
And I remember you telling me about that place, and I still need to go out and visit it, just to see where Tim once sold.
It's all that remains of the greater Akers tourist empire. We used to own 2 miniature golf courses, a car museum, a house of mirrors, just a bunch of weird stuff. We purchased a wax museum, and the place liquidated. Not literally, but the expensive part of a wax museum is actually the heads. And so we saved the heads. And so we had this room in the back of the ghost town that was just heads on walls. And my dad was convinced someday we're going to make bank on those heads. I'm like, I don't think we are, Dad. We still have them, I think. Last time I checked, but no longer in my direct inheritance.
And now when tourists go to get the tour, they're told this is where the naughty children end up.
Yes. Can we see the
With
head
the
room?
heads.
No.
Well, oh man. So we already touched on Chicago and now the museum, which are 2 points that I was gonna bring up at some point, but I'm glad we got them out of the way quick. I was also gonna say about your bio. The only thing I could think when reading it was Chaucer from A Knight's Tale. Right? That's I was like, that's how I gotta do it. Good people. Missed my introduction.
Yes. Yeah, that guy's one of my favorite characters in that movie. Actually, that's one of my favorite movies. So that, like, every time Chaucer comes up, my wife's like, "Hey, look, it's you." Kind of.
Nice.
That one never gets old.
Yep.
All right. So instead of doing the world building podcast about family history, let's do the world building podcast about world building. First off, you have done high fantasy, steampunk, bunch of blends with steampunk and sci-fi. Notably, one of the latest things you put out is Lonely Power Armor. Where, for all of the authors out there looking for like a place to start, when you're looking at these blended genres like that, where do you start?
I just like to put the things that interest me into the stories I write, and I have broad interests. I posted a picture on Instagram yesterday that said, 2 books define me, and it was Winnie the Pooh, which I'm wearing a Winnie the Pooh shirt, and Neuromancer. And like when I was a kid growing up, my dad, I don't know what normal people's dads read to them at night, but my dad would read me Winnie the Pooh and P.G. Wodehouse, who is a prominent British comedian. That bookcase right there is his P.G. Wodehouse collection. It's the only thing I've taken from the house so far. And so I have a lot of sort of odd tastes going in. When I go to write something, I never want to write like the typical, this is what everyone else has done kind of thing. And it's one of those areas where like the advice that I get from other writers and from editors and stuff always bounces off me, because everyone's like, well, figure out what's selling and then figure out how best to do that. And I'm awful at that. I'm always trying to find the interesting kind of weird niche thing. And that's always I've always run into problems with that with sales, because it's hard to describe what something is. Like one of my books, Horns of Ruin, started out as an epic fantasy novel. But if you think of Tolkien as being rural fantasy or pastoral fantasy where your stock is the Middle Ages and, Beowulf and stuff, I wanted to write fantasy where the base was more like Victorian era. And there are ways in which you can say that's steampunk. That's what steampunk is. But I was not in my mind writing steampunk. I, in my mind, was writing epic fantasy, but with, an urban late 1800s, early 1900s stock. And it's a different way of approaching the genre, because you're not really, when you think of a genre or genre tropes, you figure out what your rails are. You figure out what the goalposts are, and then you kind of work within those. But if you work from the inside out, if you say, I want to write epic fantasy, but with my base stock being the 1850s, 1860s, what's that going to look like? What is that sort of creation process going to look like? And you build out from there, then it creates an entirely different experience. One of the projects I'm working on right now that I'm really in the early stages of, it's casually called Saints of the Neon Moon, is something between epic fantasy and cyberpunk, because like Neuromancer was a seminal novel for me. It really changed the way that I thought about writing, about language, about storytelling, about a lot of different things. Like I'm a completely different writer for having had someone hand me that book in high school. And I want to write like an epic fantasy, but from a cyberpunk perspective. And that's a tricky one, because cyberpunk is really sort of trapped in the 80s. But the mentality that creates it is not. The problem that cyberpunk as a genre ran into is that you had Gibson come out with this thing, and he was deploying these really complicated systems of thought, of narrative, of structure, and a way of approaching the future that people really hadn't. And then a bunch of other writers, and I won't name them because they're famous and powerful, but they looked at the furniture of that, the dressing, the costumes, and they took that and they told other stories, but they weren't really cyberpunk stories. They were stories in cyberpunk clothes. And Gibson then went on to write, after 6 books, 7 books, he began writing what were really near future kind of science fiction books, starting with pattern recognition and going through the Hotel trilogy and stuff. They were really being set either in the very near past or the very near future, but they were still cyberpunk novels in a way that a lot of modern or near future fantasy isn't. So when someone says cyberpunk, they often mean, mirror shades and stuff. And that's accurate, but the soul, the mentality of cyberpunk is this other thing, this way of approaching futurism and technology differently than other science fiction, hard science fiction, soft science fiction had. And I want to write epic fantasy in a way that does with fantasy what Gibson did with science fiction. And I'm not there yet, but I've got notes. I've got many notebooks full of kind of how I want that to look and how it's gonna function and stuff. So usually I start with something like that, some really grand idea, some, I want to take this genre thing and I want to screw with it and I want to like make it different than anyone else has done. How do I do dwarves differently? How do I do dragons differently? What makes them particularly Akersian as opposed to just another dragon? So that's the heart of it. We can unpack any part of that you'd like to. I realized it was a lot.
No, I love Akersian. That's awesome.
Yeah. I know Haley's been taking notes already, so she's probably got questions. But I am going to take this time, since you mentioned it, writing dragons differently. You have a Kickstarter coming out that you're a part of The Worm. The Dragon and the Crow, I believe, right? That's
Dragon and the Crow is the larger world. That's just what I'm casually calling it.
Okay.
Of the Worm is the name of the story that's going to be in that anthology.
Okay, gotcha. But yeah, so you're putting up a story in this anthology, and we will link to that in the show notes. But so speaking of, coming up with kind of a new take on dragons, what is it that drives you to, like, is there, because you discussed Gibson, kind of giving us that first kick in the pants, like, hey, we can do this differently and it'll still play. What about dragons is enticing you to try and find the weird in it?
It worked a little backwards in that because I got invited to the anthology and I thought this is a good opportunity. I should take it. And so I accepted it, not knowing what I was going to work on. And there's a whole bunch of stuff behind Wraithbound that's not yet present. And I spent probably 2 weeks trying to figure out how I was going to write a Wraithbound dragon story, and ultimately decided I'm not going to. And so I discarded all of that and began thinking about, all right, so what am I going to do that makes dragons interesting in this world? And really it all came down to like, I just sort of began writing things down on paper, and I was like, do I want, dragon knights, dragon, like, how do I want to do this differently than everything else? And it ended up being a shapeshifter story, but not at all like any shapeshifter thing that I've ever read before. And I ran it past my wife, who is usually my first, the first person who's like, you need to calm down. That's kind of her job, to be like, all right, that's great. Now reel it back and let's do something that people can appreciate and enjoy. And so like, I just sort of bounced stuff off of her and, ended up with an idea of like what I wanted at the core, and then began kind of knocking around a short story. And the story, I finished the story. I was kind of writing the world as I was writing the story, which is unusual for me. And now that it's done, the short story is done into readers, my first beta readers. I now need to figure out what the rest of the world looks like. And I kind of have an idea of it. Like, I've got, again, broad parameters, technology levels and stuff like that. But, I need to figure out like how the rest of the world works, and kind of go from there. So we'll see.
Gotcha. The, contrastingly, so I was reading the opening of, or I was reading, I think it's Servant of the Pale Sword, first novella in the Blade Master. Yeah. So the opening scene to me in that novel for you, really sets a tone on the world building, like in the first 3 pages. And and I particularly enjoyed that because you get the pilgrim, you get a piece of like the magic that you're going to introduce, and you don't really know that it's going to be that until you kind of get to the end of that opening scene. But you also get the weird blend of like, you think this is going to be strictly in the past, but there are ways to skip up to this temple that are more technologically based. So where, how does that compare to, say, writing something like Wraithbound? How does that world building for you differ?
So Pale Sword is interesting because there actually was already a really large magic system behind it that I came up with just kind of for the fun of it. And again, it came out of something my wife said. We were working out, and she was like, "You know, what would be a really cool class is if we had arcane sword fighters, like people who cast spells with swords." I'm like, "Yeah, that'd be kind of cool." And then my brain just kind of turned off for, I don't know, 20 minutes. And at the end of it, I had kind of the basis for the Bladecaster series. And I had no idea what it was going to look like the world, anything. And I just kind of built the world. I've actually written 4 or 5 novellas in that world, none of which are published because they're all actually like the opening to a novel or the opening to a series or something. And it was just like, I interview worlds. I interview worlds through storytelling. And it just happens to be that Servant of a Pale Sword is the first one that was together enough that I was able to publish it. And ironically, that opening, up until we get to the point of the temple, is something that I wrote probably 3 years ago, before I had come up with anything to do with Bladecaster. It's just, I had this idea of this guy carrying a rock up a hill and going with the intention of having his memories removed, and that those memories would have to be implanted on the stone, and then he would then throw it away. And this is a theme in a lot of my work, the way that memory works, the way that who we are now is sort of a construction of the past. And as you forget things, you don't necessarily, you're still that person, but you've lost some of the building blocks. And if you're reminded of them, then maybe that changes how you perceive yourself or how you perceive some portion of the future about yourself. And I don't, like, I'm not a didactic writer, but I do have themes. I do have ideas about what I want readers to think about when I write. And memory and identity is a big one of them. And the way that, like, the construction of our past is also the construction of our future. And we're always kind of in the middle between those two things, trying to fiddle with the controls a little bit. Trying to, like, if the past is this giant boat and you're trying to, you get this little tiny tiller of the moment, and you're trying to turn the boat just enough to make your future a little bit different. And how that functions in story, and having characters in that moment of changing who they are and why. Because, I mean, the ultimate story behind Bladecaster is this guy. He's forgotten who he was, and he has intentionally forgotten who he was, and he's trying to figure out whether he wants to remember it or not. And as the story goes on, it becomes apparent that maybe he shouldn't, or maybe he should have been a better person, the kind of person who didn't intentionally forget who he was, and whether or not he can figure that out and move it into the future is kind of his story. So, yeah, but like the fact that idea, that scene came to me a long, long time ago, and then I came up with Bladecaster, and then I was like, you know what, this is where this belongs, and I kind of slotted it. There's never any wasted writing. I do a lot of writing that I don't necessarily publish, but that at some point in the future I'm gonna be like, oh, well, here it is. This is where this belongs, and pull it out and plug it in and have it fit. So, did that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, it was good. What I was kind of thinking about too was, because you had mentioned that you wrote the scene before you and then you came up with the magic system as well before you'd actually come up with the plot and how they connected, which is the, for our audience. That's there are ways. We've had Clark Rowanson on. We had him talk about like coming up with magic systems and building those out for world building. So there are different ways to kind of step through this process, and having authors like yourself, Tim, on to show us like how many different ways we can come at the exact same problem, right? That's a good thing for everybody to hear. But what I was going to say is that opening scene is a very kind of classical, almost religious iconography, right? It comes up in almost any major religion that existed or still exists. So then my follow-on question, because we mentioned it, you're the son of a pastor. How much has that played into not just the themes that you put in your stories, but how you build out your worlds when you start mixing in genres?
I mean, cosmology is central to everything that I do in these books. Like the question of not just what's true, but what people think is true, or how they misunderstand it, or how their understanding changes over time is a central aspect of all my world building. I always want that to be core to it. In the Veridon series, so I'll talk a little bit about my religious history because it's, I guess, relevant. My dad worked for a guy named Billy Graham, right? And so I grew up in the very midst of evangelical Christianity, and they were very, very strongly opposed to me being interested in fantasy or science fiction in general, because that was the devil's work, right? And so that was always a bit of discomfort in my family until very recently. After my dad retired, you could walk into my house long after I had like 8 books out, and they owned the books. I know that, but you could not find them on the shelves, and there are thousands of books in my parents' shelves, and so they were always very sort of circumspect about what their son did. And so I've sort of dealt with that. I left the church at one point for 15 years, came back, but only in a very progressive stance, let's say. I'm very open-minded in how I approach religion these days. But the point is that background was absolutely core to all of my world building. I think I get really tired of people who want their fantasy to just be about their religion, or their fantasy to be about why they hate religion. I like it to be this sort of middle ground of, it's a thing that exists and it means a lot to people, and you need to be able to build it with the same intensity that you build your magic systems or your characters or your world. It's a core part of all these things. The Hallowed War series, which begins with the Pagan Knight and goes through Iron Hound and Winter Vow, I like to say that is the series where I took religion and I built it the same way that Brandon builds magic systems, Brandon Sanderson, because it's a world that is basically inspired by the integration of paganism into early Catholicism in the Middle Ages, right? Especially in Ireland. But it's second world, so it's not like I'm using those things directly. The religions involved are a mix of Mesoamerican duology and Shintoism, right? So I always draw all these different influences in, and I try to be very mixy with it as best I can. But yeah, I mean, having a father who, I guess when P.G. Wodehouse and Winnie the Pooh, when other people were reading I don't even know what, Dad and I had like deep, heavy theological discussions starting when I was like 9. And to this day, I can still, DJ Butler's probably pretty thick at this, but like I'm very good at talking at high level theology at the drop of a hat. It's how my brain works. It's how my heart works. And so, yeah, it's a core part of what I write and why I write. The college I went to is heavily evangelical, Wheaton College, and I mentor there. They have a writing group for college kids, and I'm there almost every Tuesday night. It's twice a month. but like I want people who think seriously about religion to be involved in writing, which is not something that I think a lot of traditional science fiction fantasy deals with as much. It's kind of how I want to write. So,
Yeah, and you mentioned DJ Butler, Dave, and he, like, his Witchy Eye series delves into a lot of the different religions.
Yeah.
And to me, one of the things I like about both like what I've read so far of yours and his whole Witchy Eye series is, like, there is a solid representation of the actual things that you're pulling from, right? Like, you're not just making up stuff and then calling it, oh yeah, it's Shintoism, like, right? Like, you actually kind of know what you're talking about, and then you write it. And that that's a line that I am currently having to walk with the urban fantasy series that I'm writing, based around a lot of the Shintoism legend, and more particularly based around the legends behind the Five Swords Under Heaven, the Tenka Goken,
right,
as well as the figures that wielded them. So that's been kind of a fun aspect for me. And, you know, this will touch on an aspect that we've touched on with a bunch of other people, that research, right? And I'm sure you had the upbringing where you did a lot of your research early on, almost before you knew that you were going to write. But I'm sure also that you go in, and if you don't know something, like, you go do the research on it.
So, funny story. My first actual writing gig was in college, and it was for White Wolf Game Studios. They had just released a book or a game called Wraith the Oblivion, which is about dead people, right? And each of the worlds of Wraith had each of the base religions of the world have their own version, right? So there's Shintoism has its own Dark Kingdom of Jade, and Mesoamerica has its own. And I had pitched something to them. This was back when you could call them and just pitch something. And they liked what I had done, but they really had a need somewhere else. The guy who was supposed to be writing the Mesoamerican background had just dropped the ball. And they're like, so do you think you could come up with something in, like, I don't know, 3 weeks? And it was Christmas break. And I'm like, yeah, I've got that time. Let's do it. But I knew nothing about the Aztecs. And so I had to go read and learn a lot about Mesoamerica in a very short period of time and produce something that made sense. And I go back and look at it, and I can see mistakes that I made, but I'm still pretty happy with the way it turned out, because I do a lot of research, and because I've gotten good at absorbing a lot about religious systems. Again, like you say before I knew I was going to write, I knew I was going to write when I was in second grade. Like, that was a very early, this is my career path kind of moment. And yeah, so, but that's definitely been part of the research. I was really frustrated early on after I left the church for a while. I was like, why did I waste my time on all this stuff? I could have been learning all these other things. But I know all this stuff about religion, but it's useless to me now. And then I started writing, and I'm like, oh no, wait, there's actually a lot of material here. This is good. So it worked out, as all things do.
I love how you bring up religion and cosmology, because that's actually something we haven't hit in this podcast yet. So we've talked a lot about magic systems and, settings and using objects in fiction and those kinds of things. But I think that, so I write similarly to you, where I usually start with a world or a magic system or a core concept before I start with a character or a plot. And there's the whole kind of war that goes between, character-driven or plot-driven narratives, or people who start with world building. Sometimes the character-driven people don't understand it. I feel like there's always been a little bit of friction between me and character-driven people, because that's not where I start. But as far as cosmology, I think that recognizing that every character has a core belief system, regardless of whether that's religion or something else, is really critical to understanding where they're going to go in the plot. And so I'd love that that's somewhere that you have driven or that you've taken inspiration.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's how the world is, and all of a sudden people think that they're going to be different because there are dragons around? No, you're still going to have a core belief system somewhere. Whether you believe in sword or dragon, you're going to have a belief system. And the world is always writing is always about bringing the world into the narrative, into the structure. Again, this group of kids that I mentor, it's fascinating to me how people don't think things through when they approach this stuff. That one of the first questions one of the young writers asked me was, so how do you write Christians in fantasy? I'm like, as if they were human beings, just like I write everyone else. It's not a special class. It's just people. We're all just people. Just think of it that way. So, but yeah, everyone's got their cosmology.
How has that approach changed based on the genre? Oh, had a bit of a glitch there. Sorry. Maybe it was on my end. Does that change based on the genre that you're writing? I know that a lot of science fiction, you look at it and say, okay, people's core belief is based on science. This is what they believe in, versus fantasy, which is usually more, or occasionally more centered on, the gods, X, Y, and Z. You usually see religion more in that. Has that changed your approach for different genres?
So the science fiction that I write is always weird, right? So there's always a sense of the mystical in it, regardless whether it's science fiction of like cyberpunk or if it's more traditional like hard sci-fi. I read a lot of like we say genre bending stuff. So that sense of weirdness is always there. When I got the invitation to Sword and Planet, back when I first started writing for Baen, they were like, this is kind of like the parameter of what we want it to be. We want it to be this sort of, a Vance style, Gene Wolfe style fantasy or science fantasy, basically. And so I had to come up with, that wasn't what I was writing at the time. I was writing Night Watch and writing Wraithbound. And so I had to world build a whole thing just to write a short story. And that ended up being the seed for a bunch of other short stories that are out there now. But, I wanted to write a system where the science became the religion. And so I kind of wanted to imagine what religious roles, rampant science would fill. And so if you had a gruff system, a searching system, that became self-aware, that would become like an oracle or something. And so I tend to fit those slots in regardless of what genre I'm doing. But even in a purely sort of atheistic system like Star Trek, where they're all like, oh yeah, there's no religion. We believe in science. Well, you believe in science then. The argument against science is often miswritten, by Christians, but, it's still a belief system. It's still a way of approaching things. Humanism is still a morality system. It's just a question of what you believe in and how you approach it. So I guess the short answer is no, it doesn't change. I just try to find a way to make the genre fill in those gaps.
Well, there it is. I hope you're enjoying that episode as much as we are, and sorry we had to cut it off again. That's Tim Akers talking about religion, Chicago, weird genres, and everything in between. For those of you who are audio listeners, don't worry, you're not missing a ton yet. We haven't started posting the videos again, but hopefully they'll go up soon. Thanks to Nick Thacker and Book Career Network for hosting us. Expect that the next few episodes are going to get even weirder. Make sure to check out our show notes and find all the links that we promised from the episode. Next week, we've got Tim Akers, You're Weird Enough for Us, Part 2. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, thanks for helping us tear the world's asunder. We'll see you next time.